read, there will be some who ask, why? There will also be some who believe that they are living more fully, who say, why not? My brothers and sisters, whenever you face the trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. But ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind.
Thanks, Jack. What we're going to say this morning will be particularly relevant to any of you. Am I on the air, by the way? Here we go. Particularly relevant to those who have been treated unfairly in your life. As you reflect on life, think of the times that you have been treated unfairly. Or you might have been hurt. This sermon is going to relate to you. It's going to relate to those of you who have felt anger in the past week, month, or year. It's going to be related to those of you who have encountered some form of illness, and also to those of you who barrack for Carlton. At this stage, I think everybody's listening, because I've covered everybody. And what Jack read to us is so true. Whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And what that passage seems to be saying, it's not if things go wrong in life, it's when things go wrong. And as I was saying that last week, our faith is not an insurance policy. We're not protected from all the things that happen to other people, even though, well, I'll go through this, even though the Psalms say it at times. We experience what most other people experience. Last week I was talking about the Seventh-day Adventists and how research has shown that they live a little bit longer because of their lifestyle. And when things go wrong, I think of you lot here, and we're less likely to be gunned down in the western or northern suburbs. I don't think that'll happen to us. I don't think many of you will die of alcoholic poisoning. Well, some of you might. Most unlikely for you to get lung cancer or falling over at a nightclub at 3 o'clock in the morning. You wait until 12 o'clock when you're walking down the street. See, those things don't happen to us because it's not a part of our lifestyle. And I think that we're, in that sense, we are protected. However, if we have false expectations of our faith, we will find that we will be disappointed. And what do I mean by false expectations? Now, when we sort of find ourselves shaking our fist at God because we've got cancer or because something else goes wrong with life, we are not protected. But this passage we're looking at wasn't written for our cancers or sore toes or sore heads or whatever else might go wrong. It was written for a church under persecution. And when you think about that, it puzzles me. You would think that the early church would have been a welcome addition to society. You would think that people would be glad to see a faith that promoted reconciliation. You think that they would be glad to see a faith that brought together people, that honoured the slaves and people on the edge. It was a faith for anybody. You'd think that they would welcome it, but they didn't. When you look at the behaviour of Claudius, Nero, Domitian, and later on Diocletian, the Roman emperors, they persecuted Christians. And why did they do that? Christians were reluctant to be involved in war in many cases. They were very reluctant to go to the temple once a year and sort of say Caesar is Lord when they knew that Jesus is Lord. And because of that, they were picked on and they were persecuted. It came and went as you look at church history. And then, of course, most of the problems that the early church experienced was from people just like us. You know how New Zealanders are sort of just like Australians, only they don't have fish and chips, they have fish and chops. But when you think of the Jewish faith, we share so much in common. But the early church was persecuted by the Jews, and persecuted because they couldn't understand how the majestic, awesome God could become a part of our world and suffer as far as faith was concerned. So when we start thinking about that, we start thinking that, yeah, the early church persecution, are we persecuted today? Well, I don't think so. I know things are getting tough for the church. We're dealing with land tax issues at the moment. Probably in our lifetime we might even see a little bit of a stir going on about the fact that we don't pay rates as a church. We watched Channel 9 deal with the Hillsong crisis in a very negative type of way. But generally, the church today is not suffering under persecution. However, what I want to do with this passage is just bring it back to where we started. We can't talk about persecution, but we can talk about the things that really goes wrong as far as our lives are concerned. And when you look at the Bible, there's not one answer as to why we suffer. And when you look at the Bible, you see a development in its thought. And I want to take you briefly down, I did a whole series on it once in my previous church, why do we suffer, and the various answers that are there in the scriptures. And one of the answers is that it's because the wickedness of our lives or the wickedness of our ancestors. Now listen to this verse. You shall not, this is from Deuteronomy, you shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. In other words, if we have done wrong in our lives, it catches up with us. And you find this thought alive in the New Testament. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he might be born blind, John 9. Or you find it alive and well in the church today. People still believe that they suffer because of some sin in their lives. What have I done wrong, people ask, when things go wrong in their lives. Or another theory of suffering is that God will protect us. And you find that in the Bible. Listen to this verse from Psalms. He will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will set me high on a rock. Now, this protection idea and this suffering and sin idea, you find alive in the Psalms, you find it alive in the Proverbs, you find it alive in the Job. And then we come across the fact that, and as we start to think through this suffering, perhaps God is teaching me something through this. Perhaps God is disciplining me. And this is what happened with Job. Listen to this passage. How happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Now, what we need to understand when we go back to the Old Testament, they didn't have a strong concept of illness. They didn't have a strong concept of what causes illness. They didn't have a strong concept of the evil one, the devil. They thought everything came from God. So good and bad came from God alone. And that's something we'll talk about on Thursday morning at our Bible study. Or perhaps things might be different in the next life. And I think of the Negro spirituals and their suffering in 19th and 18th century United States as slaves. And their focus was, gee, things are bad now, but God will come and take me on a chariot to a better life. And we find that thought in Revelation. Listen to this. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven adorned as a bride for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is amongst mortals. He will dwell with them and be their God, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be with them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Now you see how things have developed? We suffer because we've sinned. Perhaps God is teaching us something through suffering, and I'm sure that Job said, "I'd rather read a book than be taught by God," that type of thing. Or that things will get better in the next life. But there's something else that the Bible says. That sometimes the Bible says, suffering is a sign of our dedication. Listen to this. "For you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." You see how there are different thoughts about suffering in the Bible? And James introduces to another one. Listen to this. He says that suffering makes us tough, produces endurance. "My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance." Now, this is different. Does suffering toughen us up as Christians? Did suffering of the early church toughen Christians up? Well, it sorted out those who wanted to belong and those who didn't want to belong. But generally you find, as you look at church history, the church did not do well under persecution. It did much better when the emperors lifted up the limits. Now, what the suffering that the early church did was produce great heroes of the church, people who saw it through to the end. And this is a constant theme in the New Testament. Hebrews, make sure that because you're suffering, you finish strong. 1 Peter, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is coming upon you. Finish strong. Revelation is all about God winning ultimately in the end. Finish strong. Now, when we think about pain, when we think about suffering, when we think about all the things that go wrong, it's nothing, really. My sore toe is nothing compared to what's going on in Ethiopia at the moment. My sore head is nothing compared to what's going on in Nigeria or Egypt or Saudi Arabia. And when we think of the third world and when we think of the suffering that is there, sometimes through persecution, sometimes through famine, sometimes because of war, what we go through is very, very small compared to all of that. Now, back to our issue. When we are in pain, when we don't see a great future, it's hard to keep your focus. And when we suffer physical pain, that's pretty bad. But let me tell you what I've learnt through pastoral work, is it's not only physical pain that causes us pain, but there's emotional pain as well. When there's rejection, when there's misunderstanding, it's something that pills just can't reach. And it seems to me that sometimes emotional pain is more afflicting as far as compared to physical pain. Now, we need to be careful. I've said that we're not going to be protected, and some people actually lose faith when they go through a bad time. And, I prayed to God that my mother would be healed, and she wasn't. She died. Therefore, I'm not going near the church anymore. That's a false promise, a false expectation of our faith is concerned. So, how do we survive it? How do we be optimistic in despite the fact that things go wrong? Whenever you face trials of any kind, says James, consider it nothing but joy. Now, we need to work out what joy is. It's not glee. It's not necessarily happiness. It's identifying with Christ and being positive during the bad times. Now, some of you have been through childbirth, and you've said it's very painful, and I know all about that. I've watched Call the Midwife, and I learned that. And when you see that, you go through that pain, and then you hold a little one and you say to your husband, "Oh, it's a boy, it's a girl, isn't it great?" And something delightful comes after that pain. And when we think about that, we can think of some positive things that happen to us. Now, Years ago, I had to have my wrist repaired after a football injury I had when I was a teenager. And I had a little operation, and the surgeon said, wear this thing. Wear it for 3 or 4 days. No way. I wore it for 3 or 4 weeks. No cooking, no vacuuming, no making beds. And the curse of every minister is moving chairs. And people say, no, don't you do it. I'll do it for you. And sympathy was at paramount. And joy came after pain. Now, I was reading a book by a woman, I'll try and pronounce her name, Sonia Lebinsky. She was a professor at the Uniting College in Los Angeles. And she talked about 8 steps towards a more satisfying life. And you know what she said? She said that each one of us should keep a journal. And despite the bad things that happen to us, to write down the blessings in life. And she used the term, count your blessings. You remember that song? Yeah. We're going to sing it at the end of the service. To remind us to be positive in light of adversity. And when I think of persecution, when I think of pain, when I think of the things that the church has been through, it's survived. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, said Jesus. And when we think of ourselves and the things that we've been through, we've survived. And we can count it but joy, because there are positive things behind the limited scene. Why joy? Well, if we can see the limited duration of pain, it's not just sort of seeing the silver clouds, but joy says the rough times will not go forever. Now, when you're recovering from surgery, some of you have had that experience, you wake up and you think, I'm going to die. And as I said last week, the last thing you want to do is to talk to anybody during that day. The first day is the worst. You get your teeth back in, but that's just about all the good that happens. And then it starts to go better and better and better. And the pain does not last forever. Some of you have been through pain. Some of you have been through marriage breakdown. And it was bad. It was chaotic. But you re-emerged and you found hope again. Some of you have had adolescent children growing up. And you remember those days, those crazy days when that child who looked like an adult was really in a child's mind. They came good. They came good. And they're one of your best friends now. You think of relationships that have broken down and how they've been restored. You think of health issues that have really crippled you and how you're doing better today. And there can be, in all circumstances, a healthy form of optimism. And as Sonia said to us in her reading, that if we count our blessings and help us to keep on top of those negative times. And sometimes we need to see alternative options as far as life is concerned. Sometimes we do encounter that brick wall, but every brick wall we encounter, we've learned that we can actually drive around it. And I think of Job, and I think of how he learnt something through the bad times he went through. And when I was in my 40s, I lost my mum, and later on I lost lost my dad, and later on I lost my mum. Before that, as a pastor, when somebody old, my parents were both very old when they died, I just thought, that's sad, we'll help and we'll pray for you. But inwardly I'd say, well, they're old and you expected them to go. When I lost my own parents, I became much more compassionate when someone lost their elderly parents. It was a learning experience for me. And I believe I became a better pastor for it. And when we go through bad times, we experience it. And those of you, for example, who have been through marriage breakdown, you're much more compassionate because you understand when other people go through it, you don't look for faults, you don't look for reasons, you just want to support that person in the bad time they're going through. Joy, consider it but joy, says James. In other words,